Good afternoon. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 7th and final talk in the Global Populism lecture series. My name is Daniel Kinderman. I teach political science and international relations and direct European studies here. And I'm the organizer of this lecture series. And as such, I'm delighted to see all of you here, despite the fact that this is a very, very busy time of year. We've had 6 terrific talks so far, and I'm delighted to see you all here for the 7th and final talk. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank everyone. There are many who made this lecture series possible, and you know who you are, a couple of very important people I can see in front of me here in this room, but a lot of people across campus. So thank you very much. Populism is a contentious subject, but I think pretty much everyone agrees that there's a lot at stake here, that this is important, regardless of where you are on the political sides of things. And I think one of our most important jobs as scholars is to explain, to understand, and also make sense of these developments. So that is the purpose of these talks, and not only of these talks, but also of the conference that the Department of Political Science and International Relations has organized, and that's also taking place. It's taken place today and will take place all day tomorrow. So I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome everyone who has come here for that conference. I'm very pleased that we have managed to bring some of the leading scholars working on contemporary populism here to speak in this lecture series, and that brings us to our speaker. Bart Bonikowski completed his PhD at Princeton University. He's currently Associate Professor of Sociology at Harvard, resident faculty at the Minda de Gunsberg Center for European Studies. So a fellow Europeanist, which I appreciate very much. That's great. And a faculty affiliate of the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs, where you co-direct Harvard's research cluster on global populism. This morning, when Professor Galston spoke, gave a very excellent speech, he mentioned that resentment is a crucial aspect of populist politics. And you will see that that is, of course, a central element of Bart's talk here. So I'm very pleased about that. Bart will be spending next year at Stanford. Kind of jealous, Bart, about that, but that's great. So a little bit about his work here, relying on survey methods, computational text analysis, and experimental research. His work applies insights from cultural sociology to the study of politics in the US and Europe, with a particular focus on the politics of nationalism and also populism. Bart has an impressive list of publications in top journals, including multiple papers in the American Sociological Review, which is undoubtedly one of the top journals in the social sciences. Bart, thank you so much for fitting us in your busy schedule. He organized and ran a conference all day yesterday at Harvard. It went into the late evening. And you're here on very little sleep. So thanks so much for fitting us in. Welcome to the University of Delaware. We look forward to your talk.
Thank you, Daniel. I fit the conference in. You were already part of my schedule from a long time ago. But I am on rather little sleep, so if I start mixing up words, you'll know why. Hopefully that won't happen too much. Can you hear me okay? Great. So thank you for the invitation, Daniel. This is great. The conference has been wonderful, and it's nice to have a chance to speak to all of you right now. Whenever I get asked to give talks like this, at venues like this, there's always a bit of a conundrum of whether to give a small paper that's empirically, rigorous, all worked out, and focused on an important but small part of the big picture, or whether to give kind of a 1,000-foot, view of a problem. Given the way the series has worked so far, I'm going to do the latter. So I'm going to give you kind of a general view of how I think populism, nationalism, authoritarianism work, and how they may help us explain the current rise of radical politics in the United States, but also in Europe and elsewhere. And this is sort of a preview of a book that I'm hoping to write at some point in the near future, maybe even next year. But underneath a lot of this, there are specific pieces of empirical research articles that I've written that substantiate some of these claims, and more will be done in the future. So anyway, the title is Trump, Populism and the Politics of Resentment. The talk will not be only about Trump, and actually I will try to convince you that populism is only part of the picture, and we should be thinking about more than just that if we want to understand radical politics. So, 3 figures here that you may be familiar with. There are a few more that I could put up. If you follow European politics, this cast of characters will be familiar to you. And some of them are former leaders, some of them are current leaders. And a lot has been written about them. Often when academics or journalists write about this kind of politics, they refer to it as populist politics, as you see in these academic journal titles. There have been books written on this topic as well that typically refer to this kind of politics as populist. Fantastic books by many of my colleagues, and it's really good work. More closer to home, I guess, this gentleman right here, the current president, upon his election in 2016, a similar set of articles, both in scholarly outlets and in journalistic outlets, asking about populism. Is Trump a populist? What is populism? Kind of wrangling with this topic. These are all interesting places to start thinking about radical politics. But the question that I want to ask today is whether the radical right is primarily populist. Sort of if you set the bar a little bit lower, is it only populist? And what do we mean by populism? That's sort of an ancillary question that we need to answer if we want to answer the first. So the point is not to quibble over definitions, which is often what scholars of populism do. There's kind of a ritualistic opening of every academic article saying, well, by populism I mean this and not that. That's part of it. That's how you situate yourself in the literature. But it's also, analytical precision is important if we want to understand the topic at hand. And by defining populism a little more precisely, a little more minimally than it often is, it leaves room for other ways of thinking about radical politics to enter the picture. And so today I have really 4 goals that I want to go through. First of all, I want to address some of the conceptual confusion concerning the radical right, and maybe touch a little bit on the radical left. Consider trends, empirical trends in the supply and demand for this kind of politics along multiple axes. Suggest a particular kind of explanation that relies on the concept of resonance, and a concept of resonance that is structurally oriented, that helps us understand why radical politics may be on the rise, and has been recently. And finally, spend a little bit of time discussing the potential risk to democracy that this form of politics poses. I will talk about the US a lot, but the arguments are intended to apply to Europe as well, and maybe elsewhere, although my expertise is mostly United States and Europe. And there are some differences between cases, of course. So the other thing to mention briefly is we tend to talk about the radical right, the radical left, as if politics can be organized in a single continuum. Of course, that's not true. That's not the case. These are reductive ways of thinking. And if one thought experiment is to say, well, what makes a party, let's say, radical right? Well, often it's sort of nativism, racism, anti-immigrant attitudes. Even if it has redistributive, left-leaning economic policies. Well, that's a little tricky, right? And so some people have used a 2-dimensional map of the political field to deal with that problem. For shorthand, I'm going to refer to these parties and these actors and the claims they make as radical right, but keep in mind this caveat. So 5 conclusions that I hope to reach and hope to convince you of. One is that populism is not the primary attribute of radical politics. It is an important one, but it is not the sole or primary one. Authoritarianism and nationalism are at least as important. Populist and nationalist discourse is not new. Both, these kinds of claims have been around for a long time in Europe and in the United States. And people are actually not becoming, on average, more racist, xenophobic, anti-democratic, or anti-elite. There's actually quite a bit of stability attitudinally, and in some domains, actually quite a bit of trend toward more open-minded and inclusive attitudes. But what is changing that's enabling this form of politics that we're talking about today is changing resonance. The degree to which pre-existing attitudes and pre-existing discursive claims all of a sudden start resonating and enabling the mobilization of certain segments of the population for political ends. Why would resonance change all of a sudden? Well, this is a million-dollar question. It's some combination, I will argue, of cultural, economic, demographic, and security shocks that, importantly, are perceived as threats to white majorities across Western democracies. And these threats, these fears, are exploited by political actors. And as a result, fears often get turned into resentments. That is, fears get directed towards particular outgroups. They can be immigrants, they can be racial, religious minorities within countries. There's kind of a wide range of options for which outgroup is targeted. Muslims obviously have been a frequent target of these kinds of tendencies lately. So there's a lot of variation across cases, but in all cases, I see some combination of a shock that enables a mobilization of resentment against outgroups. importantly, these threats that I'm discussing, and I'll get into in more detail, sometimes are experienced directly by people in their everyday lives. Economic downturns, economic problems in the family. We've heard about the opioid crisis. Exposure to rapid change in people's communities, and that happens quite a bit. But it also sometimes happens in immediate form, so that there is no actual change in experience on a daily basis, but there's a lot of kind of second, third-hand information through the media, through social networks, or simply kind of categorical references like, people like me are not doing well, even if I'm doing okay. And then what people like me means becomes a really important thing to think through. It often has, racial, ethnic, religious, and other connotations. And as you may suspect from other talks that you've heard and some of your own reading, radical politics may pose a threat to democratic practice, but also, and this is less often talked about by political scientists, social cohesion and to some degree potentially geopolitical stability. How much of a threat it is, of course, varies across cases, which is something we've heard about in the conference today and we'll talk about more this afternoon. So the goals. First, let me start by talking about conceptual confusion. It's not that people are confused. It's just that some people have, the analytical lenses people use are chosen based on the specific questions they want to answer, based on the tradition within which they work. I was trained as a cultural and political sociologist, and so I really care about kind of the attitudinal and discursive composition of the multiple aspects of radical politics, which is where my perspective comes from. And so I want to argue that the radical right is constituted, there are many different concepts out there, but it's really constituted by three elements. Populism, that is an important part of what the radical right is. Nationalism, and authoritarianism. And these are three analytically distinct aspects of radical politics, which hang together quite often in an effective manner, and I can tell you, we'll talk about a little bit why they hang together well. But they need not hang together. That is, they can be empirically separable, so that in some cases you see populism without authoritarianism, or nationalism without populism, and they're also analytically separable. So even in cases where they do come in a bundle, one can tease them apart empirically, conceptually, and then think about their causes and consequences. So why distinguish these three aspects of radical politics? Well, first is kind of a banal one. Analytical precision leads to better understanding. Okay, I think everybody can accept that. But also the fact that actually each one of these conceptual pieces has different causes, different consequences, and is sort of ontologically quite different. It's not like these are all three ideologies, actually, as I'll hope to convince you. They sort of occupy different roles in the political sphere. They're also not necessarily limited to the radical right, although we often talk about them in the context of the radical right, because that's often what people are most concerned about these days. Populism has long been present on the left. Authoritarianism has a long history on the left. And nationalism also pops up on the left in a wide range of varieties. Also distinguishing these three elements allows us to differentiate between campaign styles, between legislative discourse, but also forms of governance, styles of governance. Finally, we can look closely at what are the empirical trends in the supply and demand of these three elements. And when I say supply and demand, I'm specifically talking about cultural supply and demand, that is, the degree to which elites are talking using these frames, and the degree to which people have some sort of attitudinal preference, demand for these kinds of this kind of politics. And then finally, what I'll talk about a little bit is the resonance between the cultural frames and the beliefs. Okay, so resonance will come toward the end. There is a precedent, actually, in the literature. I'm not the first person to invent this, for distinguishing these particular three aspects of radical politics. And Kasmuta's 2007 book does this. He distinguishes populism from nationalism and authoritarianism. But he doesn't do much to theorize each one of these elements or the relationship between them. He sort of says, look, these are all three important aspects of radical politics. Let's move on to classify parties. So for him, nationalism is nothing more than just nativism, a distaste for others, right? Kind of a synonym for xenophobia and racism. Populism for Muda is an ideology, a thin-centered one to be sure, but an ideology, sort of beliefs that actors hold. And then the main point of his work in that book and beyond is to then classify parties. This party is populist. This party is not populist. This actor is populist. This actor is not. When I say actor, I mean politician. Rather than to study each one of these aspects on its own in its own right. And so what I would argue that actually we need to take these three elements of radical politics seriously. We need to conceptualize them, theorize the relationship between them, and think about the mechanisms that enable them to mobilize publics. So let me, what I'm going to do, and this sort of each part of this talk gets sequentially shorter, so don't worry if the first part takes like a good 25 minutes or something. But I want to go through each one of these three, tell you how I think we should be thinking about it, and how we might measure it, and then think about its trends over time. So populism, and to those who study the topic, none of this will be news, but you probably will notice that I kind of make my definition quite minimal. It's a phenomenon that we've seen varied across the left and the right within world regions. We've seen it vary across the left and the right within countries. This is the United States, across time, more recent years as well. And this slide was initially made way back in the day, and then eventually I had to replace the bottom two pictures. But you've heard a lot of discourse around Sanders as a left populist, Trump as a right populist. The fact that populism is not limited to one side of the political spectrum or the other is consistent with existing theories. I won't get into it in too much detail. But Laclau, who's otherwise pretty hard to read, this is as clear as I could get, the statement that we don't mean, by populism, we don't mean a type of movement, but rather a political logic involving a rarefied system of statements. Or more clearly, populism is independent. I wouldn't endorse the ideology part necessarily, but it's independent, unattached to any particular other ideology. It's almost always combined with one or more other ideological features, and which ones they are depends on the context within which the populist actor is mobilized. So populism can be attached to the far-right ideology, to nationalism, nativism. Populism can be attached to left-wing ideology quite easily as well. In fact, some of the research that Noam Gidron and I are doing now shows that socialist parties in Europe have increasingly become populist. So they've replaced class-based appeals with broad people-based appeals. In the literature, and I don't want to get into the weeds of the literature, populism is typically thought of in sort of three different kind of theoretical traditions. And the reason I want to mention it is solely the fact that which tradition you pick will to some degree shape where you look for populism. That is, what units of analysis you will use to study it empirically. And so if populism is a form of mobilization, a really rich and important tradition that comes out of Latin Americanist research, you may look for forms of leadership, the relation between leaders and parties, the sort of charismatic leadership versus other forms of leadership, the degree to which parties are formalized, et cetera, the degree to which they include otherwise left out populations, publics that had been left out from the political sphere. If populism is a thin-centered ideology, that is not a fully developed ideology like, say, socialism, but kind of a thin one, where it has some kind of basic tenets, but it doesn't solve all of the world's problems. It's not a full world view. This is the Kasmuda definition. If this is your approach, then you're going to look for political actors. Again, classifying some parties or some politicians as populist, others as not. What I've tried to argue, and in my work with Noam Gidron, who's right there, try to argue is that, and this is there are echoes of this in other work by Kirk Hawkins and others, that populism is actually a form of political discourse. And if it is a form of political discourse, then you don't look for actors whom you classify as populists or not, but rather you look at speech acts, you look at political claims. That is, an actor can make a populist claim in one setting, and that same actor can go to a different setting and make the same claim in other terms that are not populist. And this is important because it leads to the possibility of within actor, within politician, within party variation, so that a politician can kind of adjust the frames of the language that they use to one public versus another. They may use more populist claims in one campaign, and then 4 years later, another campaign tone down the populism and still make similar substantive claims, ideological claims. So I'll show you, hopefully, the payoff of looking at things this way. But it also has some implications for what populism can do and where it comes from. So this is kind of a lengthy definition that I will not ask you to read, but I'm just going to pull out a few things from it. We can think of populism as a form of political claims making, again, so the populism is an aspect of the claim, not of the actor. Like many other definitions, it involves some deep moral opposition between the virtuous people and some sort of a corrupt elite. It's kind of a Manichaean view of the world, black and white view of the world, the good and the bad, and it's fundamentally moral in character. That is, that elites have lost their way, they have their own self-interest in mind, they're incompatible with the interests of the people, they're deeply, fundamentally, morally flawed. It often also has a particular view of political representation, a skepticism towards representative institutions. And this is actually why it has kind of an elective affinity with authoritarianism, although, again, not always. And then, again, as I already mentioned, that kind of binary between the people and the elites is seen as kind of indicative of a fundamental, irrevocable conflict. And the only way to solve that conflict is to elect the populace, right? Or the person, if you were going to stick to our framework, the person who's making the populist claims. Importantly, because that person may not be making populist claims 6 months later when they're in office, like somebody in our current political situation in the United States. The content of the populist categories varies so that the elites themselves can range, right? They can be IRS, they can be Washington bureaucrats, they can be unions, right, who are making some nefarious deals. They can be Wall Street fat cats, or they can be Harvard faculty. They can range across a whole bunch of domains, right? So in this case, it's kind of an anti-intellectual populism, which is, quite frequent in American history, actually. The payoff, okay? So if we look at populism as a form of discourse, what can we do with it? So I'll show you a few figures from a 2016 paper that I wrote with Noam and was published in Social Forces, looking at presidential campaigns in the United States from 1952 to 1996, and we used some computational text analysis methods to measure the degree to which the speeches contain populist frames. The key takeaways are, A, populism has been around in American politics for a long time. Not authoritarianism necessarily, maybe nationalism, maybe not, but populism, that is this anti-elite set of moral claims. Not just, I don't like my opponent, but the elites are fundamentally corrupt in some way. It's been around for a long time. It's also been around in both parties, importantly. Again, it's been on the left and on the right. And the same candidates have used it in one campaign, but not another. So Nixon in one campaign, but not another. Clinton in one campaign, but not another. Eisenhower in one campaign, but not another. And we try to explain why this variation exists. To do so, we first look at what's the content of the populist claims. And not surprisingly, much like the elites I showed you can vary, so the content varies too. On the left, populism is typically economic. It's against Wall Street elites and kind of the way, the way in which they purchase political power in Washington. Among Republicans, it's typically anti-statist, against bureaucrats in Washington and so forth. And then generic claims that are not populist, not surprisingly, there's no statistical difference between them, right? That's kind of a control. It is also the language of challengers, the language of people who are trying to challenge incumbents, who are trying to challenge established politicians. That comes out, again, inductively out of our data. When the president is not running for office, there is no difference between the incumbent and challenger party in the reliance on populism. In all elections, on average, challengers rely on populism more than incumbents. It is also the case, this is all from the same data, that the closer you are to power prior to the election, the less likely you are to rely on populism. That is, the reason for that is, I think, quite obvious. If you were just the president, to then say Washington elites are corrupt is a little problematic. I mean, there are ways to do it. I'm sure Trump will next time around. That it's not the administration that's a problem, it's the bureaucrats. He'll try. But the degree to which you're able to make those claims successfully diminishes. And so there's actually kind of a nice linear trend. Those who have no political experience are the most likely to rely on populism, and then governors next most, and so forth and so forth. Members of the former administration, the least. And then there's also temporal change over the course of any given campaign. So if we aggregate all the campaigns, the incumbents are in blue, the challengers are in red. Challengers become less and less populist over time as they start talking to the general electorate that is less likely to buy these claims. And incumbents become more and more populist over time as they adjust to the challengers. There's kind of a relational logic that's going on here. Now, when Trump was running, I thought of this figure in our paper. I thought he's really violating our figure, like he's violating all other norms, because he didn't really tone it down, but he did tone it down after he got elected. He didn't tone down his language in general, but he toned down his populism. I'll come back to that in a second. This is, I won't get into this much detail, but this is data from 120,000 European Parliament plenary speeches. And you can see that populism there is also quite prevalent. It is concentrated on the left of the political spectrum in Southern Europe and the European periphery in economic terms. And right-wing populism is concentrated in the core of Europe, the wealthier countries. I also should have had a slide here about the temporal trend in Europe. And we also find populism on the left and the right as far back as our data go, which is 1999, but you can go further back. There are patterns, there's variation, but it's there, and it's there on both sides of the political spectrum. So if you think about Trump, he ran on draining the swamp. that was, the populist claims are quite powerful in his speeches. Once he got elected, that became less of a problem. And I would argue, one can argue against it, but I would argue that he ran as a populist and he's governing as a nationalist and authoritarian. And that is not to say that populism won't come back or that it doesn't come back once in a while. Certainly it shows up in a tweet here and there. When he's back on the campaign trail doing rallies, I'm sure he's going to return to that form of political claims making. But again, the point is that this is a switch you can turn on and off. It's not a deep ideology that you hold. It's a set of frames that you use. What are the implications of thinking about populism this way? Well, first, I would argue that populism is not a deep ideological commitment on the part of either the elites or the electorate. It is not a source of identity for most part. There are certain attitudes, certain identity-related attitudes that may fuel support for populism, but for most part, it is not a source of deep identity. It is, on the contrary, what it is, it's a strategy that political outsiders can use to gain political power. Now, what outsider means is relative, right? So it could be, as in the graphs I showed you among American presidential candidates, these were all mainstream politicians with a sort of varying degree of closeness to power. But of course, outsider status can be even greater. So Trump, who'd never had any political experience, comes from pretty far out of the political field and is very likely to rely on this strategy. It is actually, I would say, also a risky strategy because it doesn't always work. These are claims that are hard to often substantiate, but for some people and some circumstances, they work really well. If we only focus on party classification, that is, this party is populist, that party is not populist, we classify them, and that's a stable property of those parties, we miss all of this variation, and we miss the kind of strategic logic that informs the choices that politicians make to rely on populism in some circumstances and not others. And the final punchline, as I've tried to argue, is that populism has long been around. It has long been widespread in European and American political discourse. Of course, its effectiveness has varied, its prevalence has varied, but it's been a discursive resource that's been available to politicians on both sides of the political spectrum for a very long time. In fact, if you read Martin Lipset, he argues that populism is one of the fundamental attributes of American political culture when he compares it with Canada. Now, why does it become effective at some points and not others? We'll get there. Partly it's about context, partly it's about the coupling of populism with these other forms of political claims making. All right, so what is missing? So if we define populism in this narrow way, which I think is useful, it's not the only way, but it's, I think, a useful way. What is missing is all this other stuff that people are worried about. That is nativism, xenophobia, racism, anti-immigrant policies and preferences, but also threats to democratic norms and institutions. I would argue that this is not inherent in populism. It's a tendency within populism, but it's not inherent in populism. This is actually an attribute of something else. We need some other concepts to capture these elements of radical politics. And those concepts are, I would argue, nationalism and authoritarianism. And a very particular kind of nationalism, but nationalism is actually quite varied. And I began my academic studies and career researching nationalism, not populism. This is what I started with. So, I have a sort of a strong belief that it's an important aspect of politics that I hopefully will convince you of as well. And authoritarianism is the last piece I'll get to. So nationalism. A lot of people think of nationalism as nation building, right? The kind of an overt political project to sort of synchronize countries' cultural boundaries with their political boundaries, to establish nations with a shared culture and shared self-governance and sovereignty. That's certainly one way to think about it, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the historical process of nation building. I'm talking about nationalism as the cognitive frames through which all of us in this room understand our nations, and maybe multiple nations in some of our cases. These are frames to which we think. They are frames to which we understand what the nation means to us and how we relate to our nation. They involve a range of beliefs, a range of attitudes. Some of these attitudes are about who can be a legitimate member of the country. And maybe what matters is religion, maybe not. Maybe what matters is kind of ethnic background, maybe not. There's sort of more inclusive and more exclusionary versions of these kind of symbolic boundaries that we draw around the nation. So in these examples, these three celebrate diversity and difference. This one certainly does not. And this one suggests that true membership requires the right kind of religious beliefs, right? In this case, Christian beliefs. But it's not just about who's in, who's out, and what the basis of inclusion or exclusion are. It's also about what does the state mean? What is the state's relationship to the nation? Do we celebrate the state, or should we be afraid of the state? This is pretty common in the United States. It's also about what is the role of the nation in the global sphere, right? Is the nation supposed to be kind of a humanitarian entity? We're supposed to be going out there and helping others? Or is it about the projection of power abroad, the sort of the policeman of the world? My argument is that these pictures represent beliefs and attitudes that cohere into sort of cognitive networks through which we understand what the nation is. And as I'll argue in a minute, those cognitive networks map onto segments of national populations and constitute deep cultural cleavages and disagreements about what the nation is and where it ought to go in the future. And these can drive politics sometimes. So if you follow that, the argument is that we should not be thinking about national identity and nationhood as kind of a consensual attribute of a nation. That is, Americans are individualistic, and in French, everyone's secular, and that's kind of the way that the nation works. That's interesting, maybe. But I think what's more interesting is looking at within-country variation in the belief structures around the nation. So if nationhood is a sort of set of shared understandings, these cognitive frames, if we look for those empirically, we will quite often find, and I have in my research, this within-country fragmentation and actually between-country similarity. So it actually may be the case that if you pick a random American, that person may have more in common with a random French person or a random German or a random Japanese person than with a compatriot down the road, right? That's at least a possibility in this framework. There is, I would argue, a long-term prominence of these kind of exclusionary, ethnocultural, and anti-statist, anti-institutional beliefs about nationhood in all Western democracies. And people have documented this. There's a great book by Roger Smith called Civic Ideals, which identifies a long-term prevalence of multiple conceptions of American nationhood in the United States over the course of 150 years, I believe, if not longer. And he meticulously traces these competing beliefs about nationhood in immigration law. And he actually shows, it's not the case that America is a civic, inclusive nation. It is that, but it is also an exclusionary, ethnocentric nation. It just depends which definition wins at which time. And you can actually see this contestation in law. And the law is pretty messy as a result. It has the residues of these struggles with one side winning or losing at any given time. And this is also true of other countries. Importantly, which beliefs people hold and which ones are salient to them is not always correlated with the actual presence of outsiders. Timothy Garton-Nash had a really interesting lecture where he talked about, Polish populism and nationalism these days. It's anti-Semitism without Jews, and it's Islamophobia without Muslims. You can actually make these beliefs salient and important without the presence of the outsiders against whom these beliefs are oriented. So ethno-nationalism, I'm not getting into this too much detail because it's pretty much obvious, right? It's sort of exclusionary, based on ascriptive criteria. It's typically used on the radical right, although there's no reason why we can't also observe it on the left in general, and we have in the past. There's a history of nativism in American labor and elsewhere. There is kind of a tension for people who hold ethno-nationalist exclusionary beliefs. There's a tension between those quite often and what are increasingly open citizenship policies and inclusive citizenship policies. And that tension can be quite visceral, right? If what you think the nation should be is at odds with what the nation is legally, institutionally, that can be a source of powerful grievance and political mobilization. And that grievance is kind of seen by people as an affront to who they are collectively, the group that they're a part of. This is partly about racism, but it's not just about racism. If we reduce it to racism, we will not get the full picture. It's often not a very well articulated position. It's sort of some inchoate frustration with a set of norms around multiculturalism, cosmopolitanism, restrictive linguistic norms, or what is often referred to as political correctness. Again, the point is, when I talk about these things, I'm not saying that these are real problems on the ground. I'm saying that they're problems perceived by good portions of the population as important to them and as sort of viscerally experienced. In fact, there was just a paper I saw recently which showed that if you prime people with political correctness, their support for radical politics, I think Brexit in this case, goes up significantly. This is something you hear quite a lot about. And a lot of these grievances are intertwined in complicated ways with class resentment. So you've heard about sort of working class support for radical politics. That's not exactly right. Actually, the people who are really working class, people who are really poor, tend to either not vote at all, or actually they often vote left. But certainly within sort of the lower middle class, upper working class, there's quite a bit of support for radical politics. But it's not just ethno-nationalism, right? The pictures I showed you weren't just about who's in, who's out. They're about a set of other things as well. Also about national pride and different aspects of the nation, beliefs about the state and the country's role in the world. And in past research, I've empirically shown that this constellation of beliefs actually clusters into 4 discrete types of nationalism. And I won't get into a whole lot of detail here because we'd be here for a long time. And we call them liberal, or in the US case, creedal, restrictive, ardent, and disengaged. All you need to know is that each one of these categories maps onto a subset of the population, that is that we find these attitudes in actual respondents, and that they mix different aspects of nationalism in cross-cutting ways. So, for example, ardent nationalists are kind of high on all these attitudes: exclusionary, high pride, high chauvinism. But actually, restrictive nationalists are exclusionary in terms of symbolic boundaries of the nation and who can be a member of the nation, but they have very low levels of pride in the nation and even lower levels of pride in the state. And not surprisingly, they're also the most likely to vote for Trump and support radical politics. And the other thing to know about these is that these clusters of beliefs that are actually represented in the population are patterned, they're stable, they're correlated with a slew of socio-demographic attributes. They are to some degree rooted in everyday experience. And I would argue, and I have argued, that they constitute latent cleavages in the population. That is, serious disagreements about what the nation is and what the nation ought to do. These are often latent, right? That is, that they are not manifest. They're not actually being activated in any way. They're kind of somewhere in people's minds, but they're not at the top of their minds. But once in a while, when the circumstances are right, they can become activated and mobilized for politics. That is, essentially, the cultural cleavages can become political cleavages. I want to also stress, and this is important given 2016, in my work on the US, I have consistently found that these cleavages cut across party ID. That is, it's not like Republicans are all in 2 of them and Democrats are all in the other 2. These are cross-cutting cleavages across party ID, which explains some things we've seen in the last while. That is, Obama voters who moved to Trump, or never Trumpers, right? There's a set of kind of cross-cutting incentives that are built into these belief systems. And also they're cross-cutting on race, interesting. I'm talking about attitudes and beliefs, but of course they're evoked in political discourse, right? Politicians are pretty wise when it comes to strategy, and they know how to activate these ways of thinking. And we saw examples of that in the Trump and Clinton campaigns, especially during the Republican and Democratic National Convention, 2 very different views of the nation on display, whereas Sanders didn't really do that, right? Sanders didn't really engage in nationalism. He did a little bit of economic nationalism in the sense of protectionism, that kind of thing, around trade, but he didn't offer a vision of what the nation means. That was orthogonal to his appeals, maybe to his own peril. The last thing I'll say, I think the last thing I'll say about nationalism is that if you look at it over time, it's actually quite stable. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4 of these nationalist cleavages, and then each bar shows a different date. So this is 1996, 2004, 2012. There's a lot of stability over time. There's some change in the middle period, right after 9/11, but then it reverts right back to baseline. What are the implications of thinking about nationalism this way? Well, for one, unlike populism, nationalism is a deep cultural commitment for both elites and for voters, often latent, sometimes manifest. Unlike populism, it is a crucial source of identity. In fact, it's one of the master identities for many people. It has a powerful kind of collective logic, extensive cultural legitimacy in the sense that we all expect that everybody should be a member of at least one nation, that they should hold that nation dear, all that kind of talk around nationalism and citizenship. And it has a deep institutional legitimacy in the laws and institutions of countries. Nationalist cleavages are present in every country to differing degrees, and they're not always politically salient, of course. In order for them to become salient, it requires the right kind of structural conditions accompanied by the right kind of discursive mix, to which I'll come back. And often what happens is that these national identities become heightened when other identities erode. So one of the things that's happened in the United States is that identities on the left, like union labor identities, have waned over time, leaving people somewhat unmoored from old sort of cultural, institutional, collective basis of sort of identity anchoring. which actually is one of the potential factors that has allowed sort of nationalist claims to scale up and become salient. All right, this one I'll talk about very quickly. Pretty much, I think, one slide. When I talk about authoritarianism, I'm not really talking about the authoritarian personality. There's research on that, and I'm not too engaged with that research. I'm talking about a form of governance, a way of doing politics once in office. It's a tendency toward the violation of democratic norms, the circumvention of established institutions, typically in the interest of maintaining power. It's anti-pluralist in its conceptualization of the popular will, and it's sort of a strong dominant leader. It often involves particular techniques of governance, what Kurt Weiland and Jan van der Muller have talked about, is colonization of the state, mass clientelism, discriminatory legalism. We can get into this in more detail in the Q&A. And it often, what follows from it is the delegitimization of the opposition as fundamentally opposed to the interests of the nation, persecution of civil society, threats to the autonomy of the judiciary and the media. We heard about some of this in the conference today in the case of Hungary, and eventually, potentially, unfair elections or sham elections. The repertoire has diffused across countries. We also heard about this earlier today, right? This is a set of techniques, governance techniques that are quite easy to spot by leaders across countries and borrow. So, from Belarus to Russia to Hungary to Poland and Turkey somewhere in the middle, people realize that these are solutions to the problem of how to stay in power for a long time. But I want to argue this is not populism. This is something that goes along with populism quite often, but need not. What are the implications of thinking about authoritarianism this way? Well, it's rarely articulated as an ideology that somebody runs on in the campaign, although there are often hints about how strong you are going to be against something when you're in power. It's typically more of a set of practices and some diffuse beliefs. Like populism, it is rarely a source of identity. That is, few people out there say that, I'm profoundly anti-democratic and authoritarian, this is who I am, and that's how I'm going to vote, although maybe some do. But it can be justified by anti-elite or anti-immigrant or other nationalist appeals in the interest of getting the problem dealt with, right? So maybe the best way to get rid of immigrants is to impose less democratic ways of governing. Politically, I would argue, it is the most dangerous of the three elements of radical politics because it can erode democracy, right? And Steve Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt and Steve Levitsky have a book on this that's really interesting. What happens when the guardrails of democracy fail, when the norms erode, even as institutions are still there. But I want to stress that this is a political risk. In terms of social dangers, I actually think nationalism is much more dangerous in terms of what it can do to group relations. All right. So 3 different components, but they have points of articulation. They have certain elective affinities that make them go together well. In the interest of time, I won't get into all of these right now, but there's a table, and I can come back to it. That is, what I'm trying to argue here is that each one of these things solve a problem posed by the other. So one of the problems for populism is, well, if the elites are corrupt, but we are okay, who are we? And nationalism helps fill in that category sometimes, right? And likewise for the other kind of combinations of each of these pairs of ideational constructs. Okay. I mentioned that Trump and Clinton kind of epitomized different conceptions of the nation in the RNC and DNC. Well, here's Trump, right, with the need to wall off the country against dangerous others with much more intense quotes that I'll show you in a second. The Democratic National Convention, the exact opposite view of the nation. Inclusive, diversity is what the Constitution is all about, what we're all about. Some examples from Trump's quotes to show you that you can actually analytically tease apart these 3 things, that is populism, nationalism, authoritarianism. Here's some examples of nationalism. So the infamous quote about Mexico, when Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're sending people that have lots of problems, bringing drugs, bringing crime, they're rapists, right? From this day forward, a different kind of a nationalist claim. It's going to be only America first, we must protect our borders and so forth. And against the ravages of other countries, making our products, stealing our companies and so forth. The bedrock of our politics will be a total allegiance to the United States of America. So this is kind of about national identification and the strength thereof and the importance of nation over all else. And then this one, this is after Charlottesville, right? The response or non-response to Charlottesville. Good people on both sides. Populism. Come November, the American people will have the chance to redeclare their independence. Americans will have a chance to vote for trade, immigration, blah, 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 that put our citizens first. They will have the chance to reject today's rule by the global elite and to embrace real change that delivers a government of, by, and for the people, right? So this is not nationalism. This is populism. Another one is, again, whether, what matters is not the party, but whether your government is controlled by the people. And Inauguration Day will be remembered as the day when people regain control. Some examples of authoritarianism. Again, I mentioned that this is primarily a governance tactic, but there are hints of it in discourse as well, like when Trump says that essentially the justice system is corrupt, right? That it would be so great if our justice system would be able to read a statement and do what's right, implying that it does not. This one, right? Good old days when we were allowed to punch protesters in the face. Or the repeated attacks on the media, right? These are also kind of authoritarian tendencies that are signaled. In his case, signaled and not actually pursued, although, maybe. We'll see. And of course, birtherism was kind of the epitome of all of this combined. And arguably, we can't rewind history and see what would happen, but arguably, if this hadn't happened, if birtherism hadn't taken off and Trump didn't make his name on it, he probably wouldn't be president. Maybe. There are many maybes. All right. So how do these three elements operate together if they have these elective affinities? Well, there is a sort of a way of developing this admixture over time, and I'm actually studying this, trying to study this empirically now. Whereas some political actors, parties that had been pre-existing in some countries, stumble upon a certain strategy and they tweak it. When it works, they tweak it a little more. They add something else. It's sort of a kind of an evolutionary ecological process, and this actually happened. A lot of the European radical parties had been around for a long time before they were populist or nationalist or authoritarian. They had other issues. Many of them were sort of neoliberal parties for a while. And then they stumbled upon this thing that really worked, right? This mix of ideas. And then once this mix works, it's really easy for it to diffuse across countries. And you have kind of a contagion process through which this becomes an available resource discursively across Europe and now beyond. On the belief side, on the attitudinal side, I would argue that the nationalist cleavages are kind of the fuel that fuels support for radical politics. Anti-elitism and low institutional trust maybe direct that fire in one direction or another. And then authoritarian rule and tolerance for it may be the consequence of that. But again, all three vary more in salience than prevalence. I'm going to skip this in the interest of time, but if you want to know what I think about the radical left and how these three aspects of politics might apply to the radical left, we can talk about that. So I told you it's going to get briefer and briefer as we go, and I will make good on that promise. Let's look at some trends. So in terms of supply and demand trends, the kind of top line conclusion I will offer is that actually on the demand side and on the supply side, there's been a lot of stability. So there's kind of a 2 by 2 you can imagine. Well, maybe the demand has been stable, that is, attitudes haven't changed on average, but all of a sudden new politicians are coming in that are kind of reaching out to people who hold these attitudes and all of a sudden representing them. You can imagine the opposite, where actually the supply has always been there, the parties have been there, but people have changed their beliefs and all of a sudden they're supporting these parties. Maybe both are increasing at the same time, or the fourth possibility is actually there was very little change, or at least very little pattern systematic change across cases. And if that's the case, something else must explain the rise of radical politics, other than just aggregate changes in attitudes or discursive availability. And so I want to argue that on the supply side, as I've already argued a little bit, populism has long been widely available. I've showed you some research to hopefully convince you of that. Nationalism, too, has a very long history in the United States and in Europe. It's ethno-nationalism in particular. There's research on this, like the Roger Smith book I already told you about. We've seen ethno-nationalist politicians in the past. The Southern Strategy was about nationalism. The English-only movement, Pat Buchanan. In fact, Buchanan combined multiple of these elements and didn't become president. And then authoritarianism is a little harder to observe when not in power, but of course we have seen evidence of it as well in McCarthyism and Nixon's presidency, maybe in the GOP in recent years and so forth. This is just a graph of support for the radical right parties of their electoral results in Europe, and of course they've been around for a long time. And this is just actual electoral support and their election results, but the discourse itself has been around for longer. And on attitudes, I will do this pretty quickly, but there is no evidence no conclusive evidence that there is a massive wave of mistrust in elites, experts, and institutions. There is some evidence of declining trust in the EU and very mixed evidence about distrust in nation states. To the degree that there is growing mistrust in American institutions, for instance, it is quite low actually, but it's not unprecedented. In the mid-90s it was at similarly low levels. And then nationalism, I already showed you some examples of it being pretty stable over time. On authoritarianism, there's a big debate. There is a paper by Yasha Monk and Steve Foa that argues that people are becoming increasingly anti-democratic, especially young people. I don't buy it, and that paper has actually been challenged subsequently. It doesn't seem to be a very clear trend, actually. So I could show you some graphs for it, but I think I'm going to have to just skip them, and we can come back to them. Take me at my word for now. This is, well, one by Larry Bartels in Europe on all these different criteria. There's a lot of stability across countries. So it seems to be this, stability on both sides, or at least no clear pattern. And so what I would argue is that we need to be thinking about is resonance, the changing resonance of pre-existing attitudes and pre-existing discursive claims. And it's not just about the fact that you've got a set of claims that mirror a set of beliefs, and when they match, they automatically resonate and lead to political mobilization. That was kind of the old way of thinking about framing in the social movements literature and sociology. More recently, people have been thinking that, well, it's not just about a match. It has to be kind of the right circumstances. It has to be a fertile moment for these to come into resonance. And so we might ask, what are those conditions? And I would argue that those conditions have to do with anxieties and grievances stemming from a whole slew of structural changes happening quite quickly, sometimes experienced directly, sometimes mediated. They're often about, again, not only about individual experience, but concern for people like me, kind of sociotropic concerns. About affronts to group identity, perceived affronts to group identity, about lowered life chances, about eroding dignity, about sort of moral commitments that are in peril. These are fears that are viscerally felt, and they're channeled and exploited by politicians and the media into resentments toward outgroups. This is what I started with. Toward elites, but also, and perhaps even more importantly, toward ethnic, racial, and religious outgroups. What might these shocks be? Well, some of them are certainly economic. The financial crisis obviously is one, growing inequality, China trade shocks, capital mobility in Europe. But they also have to do with refugee crises in various places more than others, with immigration, with fears of terrorism and the way in which that gets linked up by entrepreneurs in the media and politics with immigration and refugee flows. But it also has to do with other things that don't quite fit the immigration rubric, right? So why does Trump care about affirmative action? Why is that something that became a topic? How does that link up with the other shocks? Well, it has to do with ethno-nationalism, certainly. But I want to argue that there's something else that links the kinds of shocks that work. It's those shocks that lead some people to believe that the rules of the game are being circumvented, that the situation is no longer fair. So a recession is a recession, right? It happens. But affirmative action is seen by the white supporters of Trump and politicians before him as a kind of a tilting of the tables, as sort of unfair shuffling of the deck. Similarly with immigration, and particularly undocumented immigration and so forth. So again, I'm not saying that I agree with that. I'm just saying that's the perception, and that's what often that perception links these kinds of shocks. But it's also about popular culture. It's about representation. It's about believing that you are seen as a dignified person and sort of a dignified group. Again, it's about perceptions, right? So it was the case that at some point the American heartland was seen as the heartland, right? That white working class culture was celebrated in the media. And of course, that had all kinds of negative implications. But that's been replaced in popular culture by cosmopolitanism, by inclusive, multicultural norms, which is a wonderful thing. But it also has certain backlash potential among the groups who are no longer sort of seeing themselves represented. It's not that, let's not go crazy with that. It's not the point. It's not like white people are not on TV. It's not about reverse discrimination. It's about the fact that what happens in popular culture is cosmopolitan norms are displayed. The norms of urban elites, right, of coastal elites and so forth. Again, a progressive moves in progressive directions that are fantastic, but they also lead to backlash. I don't want to get into which shocks matter most because I think that's a futile pursuit. I think that actually The shocks are often combined into what Brubaker has sort of termed a perfect storm, but they also vary in their importance across cases. So in one case, the refugee crisis is clearly the main thing. In another case, it's the other shocks that matter most. So I already talked to you about what they might be. They're economic, they're demographic, but they're also cultural, right? And they lead to this kind of a sense of collective status threat and a nostalgia for simpler times. Now, of course, simpler times is a racially charged term, so I'm putting it in quotes. All of these together threatened the status of previously of groups that were, if not high status, they perceived themselves as kind of at the core of the nation. And there's a pretty strong sense among these folks that status is a threat. And I already talked about unfairness. So I'm wrapping up. These problems are seen as urgent, in need of urgent solutions. Those solutions are typically political, and they're not forthcoming. They're not forthcoming for a variety of reasons, because first of all, elites don't share these anxieties and these fears, and they don't think they are problems. But also, political gridlock, the failure of the American political system, the obstructionism that we've seen in recent years, all of these things contribute to it, which creates a political opportunity for people who want to exploit these fears and channel them towards particular political ends. So this latent ethno-nationalism can all of a sudden be combined with the kind of eroding old identities and these perceptions of status threat I've talked about. When the crisis hits, where these multiple crises hit, these rapid changes, this can be turned into an actual political outcome, right? When the salience of anti-system and national political cues goes up relative to other sorts of identities. And again, this can diffuse across place. And then when it happens, what content it has and what implication it has varies across countries. So I'm going to skip the last goal about risk to democracy. They're considerable, and we can talk about them. Is democracy in peril? I don't know, maybe. Hopefully not, but quite possibly yes. And this is basically, I'm borrowing here from Ziblatt and Levitsky, talking about the kinds of mechanisms that might drive the erosion of democracy from within in a quite aggressive, slowly progressing way, so that we don't notice a sudden end to democracy, but rather there's a little bit of change, we kind of get used to it becomes normalized, and there's more change, we get used to that, and then we wake up 20 years later and what we thought was democracy is gone, right? So we can come back to that. But also, and the only thing I'll say about this slide, it's not just about democratic institutions, it's also about interpersonal relations, intergroup relations. So immediately the day after the Trump election, I had a student, multiple students actually, 2 or 3 students, crying in my office saying that they had racial slurs thrown at them on the streets of Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I heard similar reports from Berkeley, right? It's about enabling certain beliefs to be expressed that had been latent and suppressed prior, right? And we've seen a lot of evidence of this, the rise in hate groups, the rise in hate crimes. This is stuff that we don't think about as in the political science as often as in sociology, perhaps. But few people have actually studied this systematically. So takeaway, this is the last slide, I promise. To understand what's driving radical politics, we must take populism, nationalism, and authoritarianism seriously, I would argue. Not just as nuisances, conceptual nuisances, sources of definitional problems, but actually as analytically meaningful categories in their own right that can help us understand radical politics more meaningfully. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
An excellent talk. And I think we have some time for discussion.
And I have a microphone I can bring around so we can hear the questions.
Any questions?
There is one.
Here's one.
Thank you very much for a wonderful and very informative talk. I wonder what how your kind of work accounts for and factors in the cultural elements. Mm-hmm. You sort of have indicated that in your talk, but I'd like you to elaborate a little bit on that. What do you think is just epiphenomenal or not? Say the difference between the Front National in France and its particular idiom and the tradition that goes into it versus, say, the Brexit crowd in Britain. There are clear differences. There are lots of similarities. But do you think it's just decorative or sort of the end that doesn't really determine the core and the heart of the issue, or you think it's more important than that?
That's a great question. So I guess it depends what you mean by culture. If we think of culture as like national character, then I do think that it is less important in the sense that I see a structural similarity across cases, but the particular content that they're filled in with varies, of course. So the kinds of tropes that work in one country won't work in another, right? In France, laïcité is a big rallying cry. Obviously, in the United States, it's not. So there are kind of different ways of articulating these claims. But if by culture you mean meanings and discursive claims, then certainly culture is absolutely fundamental to the model I'm proposing. In a sense that if you don't have these discursive options available, then you won't have the kind of political outcomes that we're talking about. Or if the attitudes themselves are, remain latent because of the lack of the right circumstances or the right conditions and the right kind of discursive mix, then again, you won't have this kind of political outcomes. What's also interesting is that culture is quite malleable. And so one fascinating and worrisome development in Western Europe, and I have a different paper on this, and I didn't mention it today, is that actually you can base your exclusionary sort of nationalist claims on seemingly inclusionary principles. And so, for example, in the Netherlands, the Pim Fortuyn campaign in the early 2000s was about protecting the Netherlands from Muslims. Protecting what? Protecting women's rights, human rights, freedom of expression, and so forth. And that actually became a very salient frame, not just in the Netherlands, but in all of Western and Northern Europe. To the degree that actually in this paper I'm alluding to, we found that civic nationalists, those who hold otherwise open-minded attitudes, and we think those are like the best case scenario in terms of inclusion, those people actually have a high probability of holding strong anti-Muslim attitudes in those parts of Europe, not elsewhere. So it's sort of, that's partly gets to the first part of your question, right, is that you can turn some tropes that work in your specific context in a way that allows you to mobilize different parts of the public that you might have otherwise. Because what the Dutch case suggests, that actually there may be some affinity among kind of radical left and radical right to come full circle. And we've seen something potentially similar in Germany where, Die Linke was replaced by AfD in many Eastern German voting districts, right? So I think, I would certainly not say that culture is a phenomenon in general, but I would say that the kinds of cultural phenomena that I find of interest are those where there's kind of a structural homology across cases, and we see this, the content varying, but the structure being similar, if that makes sense.
Hi, thank you very much. That was fascinating. I'd like to ask you about the role of emotion in the way you think about this. I mean, one way to conceptualize what you're seeing is, right, it's all about resentment. It's all about anger. It's all about fear of your identity being swamped. So, it's sort of a level of analysis problem in part. I mean, to what extent are you thinking about this in terms of socio-cultural discursive practices, and how much of this is sort of emotional and cognitive, sort of individually psychological? Is it, or are you interested in the interaction between them?
Yeah, I was going to say, can I have it both ways? So I think it is deeply affective and cognitive at the individual level, but of course that affect and that cognition is shaped by sort of cultural, so the content of cultural communities that people are embedded in. So there's kind of a collective level to that. So I've done some experimental work showing that when you expose people to the word America, they actually end up having much more nationalistic beliefs than if you expose them to the word United States, right? So even the kind of the cognitive framework through which we perceive the country actually is actually dual, and which one you prime them with results in greater kind of affective responses. But of course that varies across subgroups in the country, and so there is likely to be greater propensity for experiencing these kinds of resentments accompanied by the fear and maybe anger, maybe rage among some segments of the population in this particular case, typically white, non-urban, maybe working class, although I really wouldn't put too much emphasis on that segment of the population. So I think it's sort of cognitive and affective at the individual level, but mediated by sort of cultural norms and beliefs at the community, collective level. And of course, these national identities I was talking about are both collective and individually held at the same time, right? I mean, they're shared across segments of the population, but they're also manifested in individual cognition and affect. Yeah, I don't know if that fully answers your question, but I guess, yeah, I'd like to have it both ways.
I think we're all being subjected to the lexiconographic massage.
Okay.
And I'd like to step back and view the problem. Democracy is essentially predicated on instability.
Okay.
Yet there's still a framework within which it functions. Think of a Rubik cube. That's a defined domain. There are a certain number of massageable elements. Yet it's always in the cube. But if you're looking for a color or an ensemble of things, they constantly change. So I'm going to leave with a little optimism.
Okay.
Instability is also a function of time. And democracy has shown many such changes, many of them to the benefit of the society. Problem at the moment is distribution's in a strange mode. You have two very stable bimodal distributions. Mm-hmm. Call them whatever you like, right, left, Democrat, whatever. And the wedge in between, which is the deciding factor, is the level of ambiguity which we have right now. And that is not predictable. It's certainly not stable, but it means things will change. So my optimism is that with time, the Rubik cube will display a color pattern that I like.
You know, you're absolutely incontrovertibly right. That is, the Earth will survive, maybe humans, maybe not. You know, time does its own thing. But I agree. I mean, the question is, what's the time frame and what happens in the meantime, right? And so it may be the case that, 100 years from now, democracy will look the same way it did, 30 years ago or 20 years ago, or maybe it'll look better. But between now and 100 years from now, a lot can happen, and I think a lot of people are concerned about that. And so there are all kinds of scenarios. We heard some of them in the conference earlier today, more optimistic ones where their institutions are stable, they can withstand the shock, they have in the past. And actually there wasn't that much to worry about. I mean, we shouldn't be complacent, we should be politically active, but things are going to be okay. And then, of course, there is the flip side, which is, I guess, the kind of the Levitsky and Ziblatt arguments that, well, once norms erode, so institutions are just as much about norms as they're about laws, and once those norms erode, it's very hard to put them back together. And it's kind of a slippery slope. It's sort of one norm erosion leads to the next norm erosion, and actually, you can do a lot of damage to democracy without countervailing the institutions themselves. You can do a lot of damage to democracy by following the law to its fullest, right? So there's no reason why a president can't, imprison former president. We haven't done that. We've pardoned the crimes of past presidents because that is in the best interest of democracy. So it's kind of a restraint to some degree against the full use, the use of the law in its full extent to the letter. That is, we've stuck to the spirit rather to the letter of the law. And that seems to be changing. Again, how far and what the consequences are, I have no idea. And I wouldn't even prognosticate. I'm not in the business of doing that. But I think, you're right. I think, one way or another, time will march on. Let's see what happens to our kids and grandkids in the meantime.
Your nationalism in the United States, it cuts across not only party ID and ideology, but race as well. Mm-hmm. Do you think that that holds true with only in the United States, or is that something that we'd see in Brexit, in France, or in these other populist segments and formations? Or is that just specifically the United States?
So I would have to do a little more digging through my data to give you a confident answer in that. But based on the reading of the literature, my sense is that you would find that in Europe as well. The notion that only native-born whites hold anti-immigrant attitudes, for example, or sort of exclusionary nationalist attitudes is mistaken. For a variety of reasons. Often it's a sort of a kind of a hierarchy of economic competition, right? A whole variety of other reasons. Often immigrants feel a very strong sense of identification with a nation, and they may actually view newer immigrants as sort of less legitimately entitled to national membership. There are, of course, sort of tensions between racial minorities and immigrant minorities in numerous places. So I think my prior would be that you would find some level of cross-cutting cleavages in this respect in Europe as well. Yeah, in the U.S. case, it's quite interesting. The restrictive camp, that is kind of the exclusionary and low levels of pride in the state, actually has a high prevalence of white respondents with low levels of education, but also African American respondents with low levels of education, for different reasons. There's actually an SNL skit about this, which I stumbled upon after the paper, where it's SNL Jeopardy, and you've got you've got African American contestants and white contestants, and they're surprised at how much they agree on, and they're like, they're basically going along and wow, we're on the same page until it comes to race, right? And then it just falls apart, of course. And so and there's also historical evidence for tensions between immigrants and African Americans in multiple communities. So it's not a clean picture of just whites versus everyone else, but there is obviously the sense of kind of threat is particularly pronounced among white segments of the population.
Thank you. Professor Bonikowski, thank you for a very interesting talk and beautiful theory that I think does allow to address a lot of contradictions involved in understanding of populism. I'm particularly grateful for separation between nationalism and populism. However, the dangers with all embracive theories is that they're hard to falsify, right? So if everything is stable and yet we still observe the emergence of populism, and then there are cultural shocks and neoliberal shocks that contribute to it. So my question would be, what are the policy implications of your theory? How do we have less populism than from your theory?
Well, the question you ended with is difficult, but in some ways nicer than the one you started with. That is, first you said, is your theory falsifiable? But let's forget that. Let's talk about policy. I'm happy to do that. Is the theory falsifiable? Maybe. Pieces of it certainly are. And I'm not even sure if the whole thing is a theory. There's sort of different theoretical parts to it. It's really a way of parsing the complexity, empirical complexity in front of us. Certainly one could look to historical evidence to see whether similar shocks that have concatenated at one time and when discourse and attitudes were available, whether that result in similar outcomes or not, and if not, why not? You could sort of do a long-term historical study of that. And then, so that's one option. And then within the different claims I'm making, you could test each one of those claims sort of individually in pieces and hope that it adds up to something that hangs together. I'm hoping to do as much of that as I can in the scope of a book, but I have a feeling that some of it will still be speculative. I guess you get to do that in books a little more than in articles. In terms of the latter part, I'm really out of my depth when it comes to policy recommendations, in the sense that I just don't know. Sociologists are necessarily trained. Well, some are, but not in the field of cultural sociology necessarily. And I could venture guesses, but every time I hear talks about what to do, I'm always skeptical. Yasha Monk has an interesting book with half of it is about what we can do. And each one of those recommendations is interesting and intriguing, but I have no confidence in whether we can get there and whether it would actually do the job that we need to do. So some people think immigration policy is the thing we should tackle. That is, change the immigration system in the US and that'll do the trick. We heard a little bit about that before. Maybe. The idea of treating, quote unquote flyover country, which we should never call flyover country, with more respect. Sure. What does that mean though in practice? I'm not sure. I can imagine what that means in terms of sort of creating a more respectful language, and maybe presidential candidates shouldn't be referring to voters as deplorables. I'm sure that Democrats have learned that. Well, I'm not sure. Maybe they should. Don't do that again, please. That just became a powerful tool on the right among the Republican candidates to rally support. So all of that matters, but of course there's also the economic side, and that is, how do you deal with inequality? That should be a really important part of this picture. But that's a terribly difficult puzzle. Inequality has been growing rapidly since the 70s. It's not stopping. That divergence of incomes is not stopping. Daniel Roderick and other economists have shown that the distributive consequences of trade, for example, in the recent years have become more and more severe. Conciliatory policies of reimbursing people for those shocks just don't work. That's not going to solve the problem either. So, we need, short of a revolution and overturning the neoliberal order, I'm not sure if there's a very obvious answer to that. And I'm not sure that would do the trick either. So I think, I do think that there is one possibility that grows out of my research on nationalism, and actually Noam has written about this. If nationhood is one of the sort of axes around which these politicians are gaining support and mobilizing support, maybe there's a way of articulating a vision of nationhood on the left that is both inclusive and respectful of the various constituencies in question. And I would actually argue, and I think Noam did, that Obama did this really well. And in some ways, Obama was in a very particular position where he could do that really well, because by virtue of sort of his direct representation as an African-American man, he almost automatically represented that constituency. And then he had the leeway to make broadly inclusive claims, including to the white working class, to the Midwest, around kind of an inclusive American identity. And that was very much front and center in his discourse. Whether that was the thing that made his campaigns work, who knows, but it certainly was a piece of it. Clinton, she tried, but it was pretty piecemeal, fragmented, and not very believable. And then Sanders totally, eschewed that whole paradigm. So that's certainly one possibility, is to kind of try to bridge the nationalist cleavages and amplify kind of the kind of inclusive civic nationalism that is not just multicultural, but it's that as well as kind of respective of all other class divisions and other things in the population. That's one possibility. I guess another implication that grows out of this is if there's some way of decreasing the salience of nationalism and increasing the salience of other identities, that would be great. But of course, that's easier said than done when the erosion of those other identities is often structural. Like, how do you get the working class to think of itself as union members, and for that to be meaningful, and for that to direct their political choices when unions have been gutted? I mean, we can try to work on unionization, people are, and that's often paying off in small ways here and there. But there's been a radical shift in the way that labor works in this country since the early 80s and before, actually. So I just it's hard to know what the right appeal is. I don't think, on the other hand, that the Democratic Party should do what some have suggested, that is, abandon explicit support for minority rights and focus exclusively on white working class interests. I think that would be a mistake. I think that would be a ceding of moral territory. I think there may be a way of bridging these divides through these kind of broadly inclusive discursive claims. So I guess that's my, that's not really a policy recommendation. It's more a strategic recommendation potentially for how Democrats might be able to articulate a vision that works.
Thank you for your talk. I thought as well that your sort of division between populism, nationalism, and authoritarianism is very useful and can kind of help clarify what's actually happening, particularly in terms of identity. But something sort of occurred to me. I guess I'm wondering how this works when the appeal is being made by someone running, and you mentioned this a bit in your research, versus when they're in power. And I'm wondering, when a populist is in power, do they ever, can you think of a case where a populist in power did not at all have any kind of nationalism in particular, and also the authoritarianism? I'm just wondering whether, because my brief look at that chart you showed suggested that nationalism fills in kind of the people. Mm-hmm. And I'm trying to envision someone who ran as a populist and continued to use populist discourse, not appealing at all to nationalism.
Yeah, the part about being in power is actually a little complicated, because I would argue that even I think I did argue that even the right-wing nationalists, populist nationalists, often kind of set aside the populism while in power and really emphasize the nationalism. But the kind of left-wing populism in recent years has not been nationalistic. And if you imagine, say, Sanders getting the nomination and winning the presidency, it's a counterfactual example, it's not a real example, but I would be hard to imagine for me him governing as a nationalist and trying to pass policies that that were sort of red meat for ethno-nationalists and Trump supporters. Right? More likely, the kind of public that he'd be serving would be, people who are economically experiencing economic hardship. It would be all the policies that he was talking about while running for the candidacy. So I think it doesn't have to be about left versus right, but empirically, recently, frequently has been, in a sense that we've seen much less ethno-nationalism on the left in Europe and in the United States, and quite frequently a coexistence of these two elements on the right. So I think in some ways there are two separate questions. What happens when these people are in power, and then the other thing is, can you have populism without nationalism? And quite often you certainly can't have nationalism without populism among those in power. I think that happens much more often actually in that direction.
So hi, thank you. So my question was about framing populism as a strategic choice rather than as an ideology. I wondered whether you thought that there might be any cases in which populism starts out as a strategy and becomes an ideology, meaning that there's explicit content that's being given to who the elites are in the case, and that over time people, even though it's sort of a strategic choice that political actors are making or whatever, or that become, that you're making salient these latent attributes or cleavages. I wondered if you thought that there was, examples in which these then become very entrenched in people's beliefs or ideologies.
Yeah, that's a great question. And one thing I didn't mean to suggest, by the way, is that there are no parties or political actors who rely on populism frequently. That's not the claim, right? It's more that we should let that be an empirical question, so that some might rely on populism sporadically, others might rely on it quite frequently and maybe chronically. And so I think the latter possibility is partly an answer to your question, so that certainly there are certain politicians, certain parties that have come to rely on populism very, very frequently. That is their main kind of recurrent claims-making strategy. I'm still using the word strategy for now. So, Front National, for instance, Le Pen for sure. The question, does she rely on those claims in every setting? Is the discourse the same across all settings? Probably not. Would she retain that populist claims-making strategy while in office? Who knows? Probably not. But whether it has become an ideology, I guess the question is, how would we know, right? One possible way to know is if in every context, that is kind of the leading frame through which a politician would see the world. But in some ways, there's kind of a sense that ideology also is kind of deeply held, and that it provides answer to multiple problems. It provides kind of policy recommendations for how to go about solving those problems. And I'm not sure that populism does that. So, the thin-centered ideology idea that Muda has is kind of a halfway point, that it's sort of deeply held and it's used frequently, but it is not a complete worldview. So I guess that's kind of one way to meet halfway between strategy and ideology per se. Right, yeah, oh, sure. Sure. Yeah. So that's a great point. So on the demand side, this is a little tricky. So I'm a little skeptical of the search for populists in the population, in the sense that I'm not sure what that means, and I'm not sure if anyone will actually be a self-avowed populist and claim that identity. Now, I know that many of my colleagues who study populist attitudes are using that as shorthand, and I'm fine with that. So there are certain attitudes that lead people to support politicians who make populist claims. Anti-elite attitudes, Catherine Kramer's stuff on kind of country versus city, right, and the deeply entrenched identities around local context that lead people to be very skeptical of big city folk, right? Viewing their interests to be incompatible and the culture being incompatible. I think that all of that is real. Whether they're populists, I'm not sure, but they certainly hold certain attitudes that make them probably quite likely to respond favorably to populist claims. So the question is, do these people hold populist ideology, and is that just a semantic difference or not? I think the reason why it might be useful to sort of disentangle these things is that they may hold certain things, they may be sort of be skeptical of expertise or intellectuals, for example. Some other people may be skeptical of urban elites. And this is kind of how people have tried to compose these indexes of populist attitudes. Whether that's an ideology, whether that's a sort of worldview, or sort of individual attitudes, kind of this is both an empirical and conceptual question. But I can see that argument, right, in the sense that these may be more durable sets of beliefs. So if you've lived in a small town in Wisconsin, you may have had strong anti-urban, anti-elite views for a long time, and maybe that's sort of a stable set of beliefs. So yeah, I'm on board with that. Whether that means that you're a lifelong populist, I'm not sure.
Well, you're defining populism as anti-elite strategy, or like
That's right.
using a contrast between elite and the people or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Strategy. So if people feel like in terms of their ideology was stable, is that they define the elite as the urbanites, the
Sure.
intellectuals or whatever, then I don't know what the difference is. I mean, they may not say I am a populist, but they may say I am anti-urban, and that would be the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, sure. I think what the strategy part is more on the supply side than the demand side, in the sense that it's kind of a frame that's very flexible and varies a lot across context. On the attitudinal side, I think the research on populist attitudes, quote unquote, is pretty recent, and so I don't know if there've been too many longitudinal studies to see how stable these attitudes are, how important they are in people's self-concept. They certainly may be related to kind of local community identity, and so there is some research on kind of communitarian versus universalist cosmopolitan identity. So there may be something like that there. So I'm certainly open to that possibility. I so far have been studying populism mostly on the supply side, where it seems much more fungible and much more kind of dynamic. But good point.
Anyone else? Other questions, please?
You were hesitant to describe the situations that this can arise in because they are different from country to country and from area to area. But is there one commonality that you found, or a group of commonalities other than the threat that has stuck out to you?
Commonalities across cases. Yeah, I mean, in the sense that in the ingredients are similar in all cases, right? So, whether it's Brexit, which is not about typically Muslim, it wasn't mostly about Muslim immigrants, it was about Polish immigrants, or whether it's sort of Islamophobia in France, they're both motivated by the same kind of desire to protect the nation, and maybe kind of a nostalgic nationalism about getting back to what the nation used to be. And they're also the same kind of populist. So the structure of the claims I'm making spans the cases. The shocks themselves also span the cases, but again, with some variation. So there's commonality in that. There's quite a bit of commonality in the kind of sociodemographic basis of support for radical right candidates, although also quite a bit of variation. So the one source of commonality is, again, the non-urban residents is pretty frequently predictive, although not dispositive. Obviously, class orientation or sort of class identity. And age used to be pretty consistent, but age is no longer consistent. Actually, varies tremendously across countries. There was a bimodal age distribution increasingly in some countries, in France and Austria, perhaps in Germany, although not as markedly in Poland, where you actually have young people who are also supporting these parties, and so it's no longer kind of a linear age trend. But yeah, you can find a lot of similarities while still being open to variation in the specific shocks and the sort of specific content in which they're mediated politically. And the other thing, I guess, commonality is that the threats to democracy themselves may be similar, although the ability of the institutions to withstand is likely to vary. Right? So one argument, which I think I agree with tentatively, is that democracies that are established, that have long-lasting institutions, may be more resilient to this stuff than the newer democracies, although the jury's still out whether that's actually the case or not.
Hi, thank you. I really enjoyed the talk. It got me thinking, which is always dangerous. this isn't really your problem, but you're talking about radical right politics, and you conceded that it's not necessarily always right. Would you concede it's not necessarily radical either, insofar as when I teach out of my little textbook comparative politics, there's radicalism, there's conservatism, there's reactionary, progressive. So do you see, is it also potentially reactionary right politics or reactionary? Maybe this is a minor point, but it seems like when you talk about going back to either an actual former state or an idealized former state, like making America great again, it can be as powerful as going towards something we've never seen, right?
Sure. Yeah. No, that's a great point. It actually comes back to Kurt's point from earlier when he was sort of critiquing a paper based on the terminology of radical right, whether that's the appropriate one or not. So I'm using it as shorthand because otherwise I get into a terrible tautology. And actually, there's a really nice Matthias Rodown has a new paper that's coming out that has a nice graph that categorizes the countries in a whole bunch of dimensions and shows which ones are radical right populist, non-radical right populist, non-populist radical, like the whole thing. And that's really interesting. That would be a morass into which I'm trying not to step, because essentially what I could say is, well, when I say radical right, I mean those parties over there, right? That heterogeneous bunch, which happens to be defined by jointly relying on populism, nationalism, and radicalism, but that then becomes, on both sides of the equation, which is sort of inescapable. I mean, Muda does this too in a 2007 book, right? It's about the radical right parties, and their three characteristics are these qualities. But of course, he's also open to the fact that there's a lot of heterogeneity among those parties. So I've sort of avoided that by using this umbrella category, which I'm playing fast and loose with. I acknowledge that. But the second part of it. So the other thing is I'm certainly open to suggestions on how to better conceptualize this. Whether we see the same three phenomena among reactionary parties, radical right parties, far right parties, or some combination of those. I mean, actually, it would be kind of nice to look at it inductively, maybe, if we were to arrange parties in a multidimensional space, not just left-right, because it's extremely limiting, and then look who's using these claims and what combinations, and do some sort of inductive clustering. That could be pretty interesting to see whether it spans our usual ways of thinking about radical far right and other categories. The second thing about nostalgic nationalism, forward, these are pretty flexible discourses. I think nostalgic nationalism has been really powerful and has been used in multiple cases in a variety of ways, because people have a tendency to think that there was a golden age at some point, much like people have a tendency to believe in national founding myths, which are largely myths. These are just powerful tropes. So if you say, oh, remember the golden age, that's usually undefined time. We should get back to that. I mean, that's both backward-looking, but it's also forward-looking. It implies a set of steps to get there in the future. But of course, there are other cases where people kind of reimagine what a nation is without hearkening to some past, imagined or otherwise. I mean, it's always interesting, like what year does Trump want to go back to, right? I think the 50s, right? It's hard to know, right? But it's certainly, whatever the year is, it's a year when people knew their place, right? Like that's the underlying subtext, and which people is also a subtext. But it's powerful in its vagueness, much like a lot of populist claims are powerful in their vagueness. It's the we, it's the us against the them, and then you fill in the them, but you often don't fill in the we because that becomes flexible, right? Anybody can fit into the we.
Another question, please.
Hi, thank you for the lecture. It was really, really interesting. I was just wondering if you had any ideas about why, I know you use the term right, like kind of loosely, but I was just curious as to why we're seeing more of a rise in the right and how the right populists are so much more effective and successful in getting in power versus why the left just, the only left populist I can really think of is Bernie Sanders, whereas most of these populists we see are like right.
So that's sort of an open question. I think there was a sense in a lot of Europeanist research that it's only recently that some sort of radical populist left has appeared on the scene. So Syriza, Podemos, etc. But actually, some of the research that we've done in the European Parliament suggests that populist sort of claims making has been around for a long time on the left, and in fact, as I mentioned, a socialist left has increasingly become a populist left. Now, so in terms of just prevalence of that kind of talk, it's very much there. The parties are there, but they have been less a source of consternation, and they've been probably having less impact on policy. Although how much impact the radical right has had on policy is also to some extent debatable, right? I mean, it's more it's certainly in Europe, it's more about the fear of what might happen than what's actually happened if you exclude Hungary, Poland, right, Turkey and Russia, right? But Western Europe, it's been mostly like the lurking fear of what might happen, but of course it hasn't quite yet. Well, I guess Brexit would count, right? I guess Brexit. Okay, I guess I'm giving counterexamples to my claim. Maybe it's not as rosy as I thought. But on the left, I mean, the other question is like, what would we expect the radical left to do? And chances are that most of what it would do is redistributional and sort of an economic sphere. So it's just likely to get us less excited and scared than what's going on in the radical right. In the US case, you're right, that Sanders was unusual in the Democratic Party. I mean, it's just a sign of the times that people are open to kind of populist claims on both sides of the political spectrum. Right, on sort of anti-establishmentarian claims, and that was, the conditions were ripe for somebody like him. Whereas prior to Sanders, most of the populist claims among Democrats were made by mainstream actors, kind of just conveniently using these turns of phrase, as I showed in the graph. We'll see what happens next. I think, we don't know who the candidate will be. If somebody like Warren, chances are that she would combine populist claims with economic justice arguments quite powerfully. Chances are she would do, I don't know if a better job, but she would pursue a different strategy than Sanders did on the nationalism front, too, I imagine. So that could be interesting. But of course, we have no idea who's going to emerge, so we'll see. I guess the point is that whether left-wing populism, let's say, is part of the political scene or not is going to be revealed in a few years. Actually, maybe in the congressional races this year, but most likely in 2020.
We've got one more.
I was just wondering if you could briefly speak to something you touched on earlier, was that a lot of the sentiments that we associate with the far right and populist actors such as racism, xenophobia, or nativism have actually been rather stable over time, and that it's just the resonance and utilization of these sentiments that has, at least seemingly certainly, as evidenced by this, lecture series, populism's really taken off, oftentimes in the far right, using some of those sentiments. And I was wondering if you could briefly speak to, or even speculate on, what simultaneously brought about the conditions of that emergence in several different nations under a variety of circumstances.
Yeah. Well, I guess that would come back to the arguments about the structural changes I was referring to. So kind of a confluence of economic shocks, demographic shocks, of cultural changes, and sort of political gridlock, or the perception that politics is not working, sort of all happening at once, because politics would be the solution to these problems. And so, obviously in Europe, the refugee crisis has been hugely important. Obviously, the economic crisis was important, but also, the same kind of cultural tensions that I was illustrating with the pictures in the U.S. are also really important in European countries. So during Brexit, it was very much about keeping Britain British, right? About people outside of London concerned about the fact that their small towns all of a sudden have Polish stores with Polish language on them, and that's kind of corrupting British culture, really English culture, important distinction. And so I think there's all of these factors are probably present in all of the cases, but to differing degrees. So the Polish case, there you have, it's actually a pretty hard case to explain, because you've got actually economic well-being for most part. It's the country that's doing the best economically through the crisis. By all standards, it's sort of in good shape, and then you've got peace moving into this radical direction. There may be a piece to that, for instance, about economic inequality that's geographically stratified across the country, so the countryside wasn't getting as many benefits or perceptible benefits as the urban centers, so you've got this rural-urban thing going on. There is this powerful Polish narrative of victimhood. You know, Poland is the Christ of nations, and this feeling that there's always the onslaught from the east and from the west and from within. And so the anti-Semitism and Islamophobia were very kind of ripe discourses, even though on the ground there wasn't much going on. But there was kind of a broad fear that, oh, you know, the refugees are coming to the Balkans and to Western Europe, we're next. So I think, you know, you actually see similar kinds of discursive formations, similar kinds of perceived shocks in a lot of these places. Whether it's always sort of economic shock to the country as a whole may vary, whether inequality is more important than the cultural stuff may vary, but it's really about relative prevalence rather than absence or presence, I think, for most part.
Do you think with the U.S. About the lack of like voting itself and how that may contribute to the more extremes of populism?
When you say lack of voting, do you mean like sort of violations of voting rights in the sense?
No, just like only
turnout.
Yeah, the turnout itself.
Yeah, turnout's really interesting. There are many. This is really political science territory, but by some accounts, the U.S. has always been the most democratic nation in the sense that everybody votes for everything all the time, which of course leads to voting exhaustion and low turnout. There are many other reasons for low turnout, some of which are institutional disenfranchisement and so forth. But it is interesting that in many cases, U.S. included, these radical politicians are able to mobilize people who are not part of the political sort of voting public in the past. So many first-time voters who then turn out for anti-establishment candidates. So that that's part of the puzzle. But that's also true in Europe to a large extent, where voter turnout is higher. So I'm not sure. I mean, that's really kind of in the domain of political science. What I do know is that the various disenfranchisement laws are certainly part of the problem. If you think the problem is the ability of the Democratic Party to withstand some of these pressures, right? So there's been work in political sociology and elsewhere done on felon disenfranchisement, and really interesting papers by Jeff Manza and Chris Eugen on rerunning essentially past elections if we were to allow former felons who've served their time to vote. Right, and not all elections flip, of course, but a couple of Senate elections flip and one presidential election flips. And so I think voting in general is a really important thing to think about. And the degree to which people who are previously politically unmobilized all of a sudden become mobilized by these kind of radical actors is one important channel through which they gain support.
Stimulating and thought-provoking discussion, and of course an excellent talk, but even the best of things must eventually at some point come to an end. So please join me in thanking Professor Bonikowski. Thank you so much.